lost engine number 2.
High above the Mediterranean, two pilots struggle with a stalled engine.
Engine relight. Negative.
Stop. Engine 1 is flamed out.
45 miles from land, the pilots make a difficult decision.
Prepare to ditch. Oh my God, be merciful.
Passengers are forced to make life or death decisions on their own.
Do not inflate your vest!
The accident will tear families apart, set in motion a massive rescue effort at sea, and trigger a multinational investigation to discover why both engines on one of the world's most popular planes stopped in mid-flight.
Mayday.
August the 6th, 2005, Bari, Italy. An ancient port town on the Adriatic Sea, where the past meets the present. Just north of this historic city, Bari International Airport serves 10 major airlines and more than 1.5 million passengers each year. One of those carriers is Tunisia's Tuninter Airlines. Captain Shafiq Garbi is a pilot with Tuninter. Today, he's in command of Flight 1153. The 45-year-old Tunisian is a military-trained pilot with a flawless flight record. Garbi's co-pilot is 28-year-old Ali Kabair.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
2,700 total?
Yes.
Captain Garbi and his co-pilot flew from Tunis to Bari this morning to collect 34 Italian passengers. Now they're going to fly them to Jerba, a Tunisian resort island. Among the passengers is 31-year-old police officer Luca Squicciarini. His girlfriend Paola is traveling with him.
Our first choice wasn't Jerba, it was Cape Verde. The thing with Cape Verde is that it was a period of terrorist activities. The flight would have left from either Rome or Milan. Since they are two large airports, Paola was afraid that there would be an attack, so we chose not to go to Cape Verde. It was my first trip with Paola. We met the previous winter. We had plans to marry the following year.
To tighten your belt, pull on the loose end of the strap. To release your seatbelt, lift the upper portion of the buckle. Ladies and gentlemen, your life vests are located beneath your seats. To inflate the vest, pull firmly on the red cord, only when you're leaving the aircraft. If you need to refill the vest, blow into the mouthpiece.
Yes, LBB, flight 1153. Permission for takeoff granted.
Roger that. Clear for takeoff. Final prep for departure.
The crew is flying a French-made ATR-72. The small turboprop is perfect for short flights. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance or guzzle a lot of fuel. Just after 2:30 in the afternoon, the plane takes off. 49 minutes after takeoff, Flight 1153 is 400 miles away from its destination, Jerba.
So we started chatting with other passengers. We were all excited. We talked about the vacation.
Like Luca and Paola, Barbara Baldacci is on her way to Jerba for a vacation with her fiancé, Francesco.
Barbara
was 23 years old. She was on the verge of realizing her lifelong dream of graduating in biology. After writing her final exam, she decided to take this vacation with her fiancé, Francesco.
Then 75 miles from the nearest land and 23,000 feet above the sea, the plane's right engine stops working.
We've lost engine number 2. Let's get to 17,000 feet.
TUI 1153, request 170.
TUI 11.
Captain Garby begins an emergency descent.
Sending 170.
When you have a single engine flameout, you would descend down to a lower altitude, the air is thicker, the propeller is more efficient.
Under current conditions, the ATR-72 can best fly on one engine at an altitude of 17,000 feet.
Power lever, flight idle. Start button.
The crew struggles to restart the right engine.
Negative. Fuel supply, check.
But then, less than 2 minutes after the first engine quits,
Stop! Stop. Engine number 1 is flamed out.
both of the plane's engines have stopped.
Si è spento inizialmente il motore destro.
The engine shut off.
Inizialmente pensavamo fosse addirittura un
Our
attentato,
first thought was of a terrorist attack, since there were so many at the time. We tried to figure out what was happening, so we looked towards the cockpit to see if someone was trying to sabotage the plane.
Se qualcuno voleva sabotare l'aereo.
The plane is now falling to the sea at 800 feet per minute.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. TUI 1153. We have lost both engines. Request immediate landing at Palermo.
The crew still hopes to reach an airport, but they have 70 miles of ocean to cross before they're over land. Crews are trained for almost anything. There's a checklist for them to follow to solve most problems, including what to do when both engines die.
Both engines flame out checklist. Fuel supply, check.
The pilots don't know why their engines have stopped. The only clue they're getting is a low fuel feed warning.
A low pressure warning light tells the pilot that there's low fuel pressure going to the engine. Now that could be a mechanical problem, or that could be a contamination problem.
The crew follows the steps laid out by the manufacturer to relight their dead engines.
Fuel supply, check. Power lever, flight idle. Start button. Engine relight. Negative.
Get Shokri.
The captain asks the cabin crew to bring the onboard engineer, Shokri Habui, to the cockpit.
Palermo approach. This is TUI 1153. We have lost both engines. Request immediate landing.
The closest airport is in Palermo, on the Italian island of Sicily.
TUI 1153, Palermo. Affirmative, you are clear for landing.
Palermo approach. What is our distance to the airport?
Your distance to Palermo is now 48 nautical miles.
An ATR-72 will fall from the sky at a predictable rate. 1 foot down for every 16 feet forward. 48 nautical miles is further than the plane can glide.
I don't think we're gonna make it.
If they can't restart their engines soon, they'll be forced to ditch in the sea.
Ditching at sea is a very difficult decision to make because it's the hardest thing to do. You have swells, waves, wind. Is anybody going to see you? How long can the plane float for?
Landing a passenger plane on water is extremely dangerous. In 1996, an Ethiopian Airlines pilot was forced to bring his 767 down on the Indian Ocean. The ditching was recorded by a tourist on a nearby beach. 50 people survived, but 125 people died. The crew of this small plane doesn't usually include an engineer. When there is one on board, he usually travels in the cabin.
I remember this person looked at the stewardess and shook his head as if saying no after the second engine had shut off.
Per cui allo spegnimento di tutti e due i motori. per cui lì ho capito che stava cercando di fare qualcosa
That gesture showed there was nothing left to do.
per far funzionare questo aereo, però mi sa.
The crew of Flight 1153 has tried all it can. They're running out of time and options. Flight engineer Shokri Haboui has joined in the struggle to get Flight 1153's engines started.
You've run the checklist.
Yes.
The captain hopes the engineer will know something that isn't covered by the checklist.
Attempt to restart the engines. Right engine first.
Fuel supply, check. Engine 2 start, power button, on. Engine relight, negative.
Palermo approach, TUI 1153. Any closer airport where we can land?
Negative 1153.
Palermo Airport is the closest airport to your position.
We're not gonna make it. Prepare to ditch. Oh my God, be merciful.
A me non hanno detto nulla. Io mi sono accorto che qualcosa non
No
andava.
one said anything.
Perché
I
sono
noticed
spenti
something
due
wasn't
motori.
right because the two engines
Più di
shut
una
off.
volta io ho cercato
More than
di
once, I
attirare
tried to get the
l'attenzione
stewardess's
delle
attention,
hostess,
asking
se
what I
dovevo
should do.
indossare il giubbino, se mi
If
dovevo
I had to
mettere
put on the
piano,
life
se mi dovevo
jacket,
togliere le
if I had to
scarpe.
stand, if I should take off my shoes.
Nessuna
I got no answer. She was in shock and started to cry.
Era sotto shock e ha pianto.
The senior flight attendant does give the passengers direction.
The captain has decided to land the plane at sea.
Le lascio immaginare.
I'll let you imagine the panic on board. People were screaming and crying.
Please stay calm and follow your crew's instructions.
There were people in the front seats that had a baby girl. She had been playing and was so excited. To now see the panic in her mother's face made me feel so sad.
Tantissimo.
TUI 1153. What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Captain Garbi's fuel gauge shows that he has plenty of fuel. But for some reason, neither engine will restart. Just 10 minutes after the trouble began, the plane is 7,000 feet above the ocean and falling. Outside, it's completely silent. But in the cabin, there's panic.
Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened.
My first instinct was to undo my seatbelt to prevent getting trapped when we hit the water. I didn't want to be trapped in my seat and go down in a horrible way. Secondly, I put on my life jacket and quickly blew it up. I did this to soften the blow of the impact.
Il giubbino di salvataggio e l'ho gonfiato subito.
Do not inflate your vests until you left the plane.
A plane ditching at sea will more than likely fill with water. That's why safety procedures call for passengers to only inflate their life vests once they've cleared the plane. Otherwise, they could become trapped inside the flooded fuselage and drown. In the Ethiopian Airlines crash, many passengers ignored this advice and drowned after surviving the initial impact.
Negative.
The dead engines aren't the only problem confronting the crew.
Engine 2 start, power.
Many of their instruments get their power from the engines.
Light, negative.
Without the engines, some vital gauges are dead.
On a two-engine flameout, you go on your standby instruments, which is you have an attitude indicator, you have an altimeter.
Fuel supply, check.
The crew continues to try to restart their engines, but it's become clear that they've run out of time.
They're not doing anything.
Confirm distance, please.
Your distance is now
20 miles.
Boats. I see boats.
Choosing to ditch near a ship or a vessel is not written in any checklist. It's just good airmanship because the rescue can start immediately and it increases your chances of survival.
Palermo approach. It's TUI 1153. We can't make it to the airport. We see two boats on the left side. We're going there. If you can, please call.
Captain Garbi turns his plane towards the boats.
Can you send helicopters or something similar? Fast, fast, fast.
Emergency. All marine units, aircraft in distress, 20 nautical miles off Palermo.
Even before the plane hits the water, rescuers are on their way.
I had very little information. We didn't know the nature of the crash or anything about the plane.
Autopress. Dump.
Although it's a rare maneuver, there is also a checklist for ditching a plane in the water.
Oh, full close.
Before ditching, the crew ensures all landing gear is retracted to help the plane land more smoothly.
Landing gear lever up.
When pilots ditch, they want their airplane as streamlined as possible so that it glides across the water when it hits. Pilots must not only monitor the systems on the plane, they also have to assess conditions at sea. They don't want to hit a wave head-on.
If you hit perpendicular to the waves or swells with the aircraft, it's like hitting concrete. The plane will break up.
Passengers can see what's coming.
I was hanging on tight to the seat in front of me, and through the window, I could see the impact was imminent.
The crew is 700 feet above the sea.
You're with me, Ellie, huh? Careful. Shockery, ready?
Ready.
Here we go. There is no other God but Allah. Muhammad is his messenger. In the name of God, merciful, merciful.
At a speed of 145 miles an hour, the plane collides with the sea.
I lost consciousness. I woke up in the water. I was 2 or 3 meters underwater. I came up to the surface wearing only my pants. I had lost my life jacket and clothes on impact. I got to the surface and grabbed onto a bag. I was in shock. I was surrounded by everything. My thoughts were constantly with Paola. I thought I was going to die because I was spitting blood. I felt my lungs filling with blood.
Captain Lockerbie survives, but has been seriously injured. Co-pilot Ali Kabair has also survived, but flight engineer Shokri Haboui is killed. No one aboard the nearby boat saw Flight 1153 crash into the sea. The plane has broken into 3 pieces. The tail section and much of the fuselage sink to the bottom of the sea. But the largest section, containing the 2 wings, stays afloat. It becomes a makeshift life raft for survivors. But not all of the passengers have survived. Many haven't made it out of the plane and to the surface. A fleet of rescue personnel are en route, including Admiral Vincenzo Pace of the Italian Coast Guard. Rescuers must travel 26 miles through heavy seas to get to the crash site.
The sky was very visible, but the water was agitated. This caused some problems to the recovery mission.
Helicopter pilot Stefano Borrigana is one of the first to arrive at the scene.
The approach control asked us if we were aware of ditched aircraft out of the coast of Palermo, and if we were able to help them to locate the airplane. When we approached the airplane, we could see the wings floating. There were several people in the water around the aircraft, all floating, and everybody with their jacket inflated.
Burigana spots Luca Squicciarini floating, away from the main wreckage.
There was one man without his jacket, and he was the farthest from the airplane. I decided to go over him and throw one of our life jacket to him.
The Coast Guard arrives and begins pulling survivors from the sea.
The actions of the people in the water made us very agile. Because of what they were doing, we ourselves did not panic. We had the calm collaboration of all these people because despite what happened, they knew help was coming and they would be rescued.
Within the hour, the crash site is teeming with rescuers. They search for survivors from the water and from the air. "23 people are pulled from the Mediterranean Sea. But 16 have died in the crash, including Paola Di Ciaula.
My relatives told me a couple days later, while I was still at the hospital, I had no reaction. Paola was gone. I reacted when I got home. When I got home and went to the cemetery, I realized what was happening. That's where I got really down.
Barbara Baldacci and her fiancé Francesco are also killed.
Sembrava impossibile che potesse essere successa una tragedia.
It seemed impossible that this terrible tragedy would happen, because Barbara and Francesco were great swimmers.
Erano nuotatori, avevano il brevetto di nuotatori.
They used to go underwater without any problems. How is it possible that many on that plane saved themselves and they didn't? I was stunned and incredulous.
Io rimasi incredula ed impietrita.
It's quite likely that none of those who died ever had a chance to swim to safety. Their serious injuries would have prevented them from escaping after the plane hit the water. In this accident, most of the survivors were seated in the rear of the plane. Most of those who died up front. Those sections, along with some valuable clues, are now at the bottom of the sea. The one section that didn't sink is towed to the port in Palermo and taken to a nearby hangar. A team of agents from Italy's National Flight Safety Agency, the ANSV, begin looking for leads. Their job, find out why Flight 1153's engines stopped in mid-flight.
We need to collect as much as evidence as possible in order to fulfill two main answers. What happened and why had it happened?
They are led by Chief ANSV investigator Vincenzo Panetta.
I arrived in Palermo the day after the accident, on the 7th, very early in the morning.
Per piacere, permesso.
A flight test engineer by training, Panetta has led several air crash investigations. The engines and central fuselage of Tuninter Flight 1153 have been recovered. The rest of the plane lies somewhere off the Sicilian coast.
The main challenge of the investigation was the fact that the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder and also the front fuselage were 1,500 meters under the sea.
While the Italian Navy conducts a deep-water search for the rest of the wreck and the crucial black boxes, Italian investigators are given some assistance by the plane's European manufacturer. ATR's Giuseppe Caldarelli is here to find out if there's a flaw with the company's plane.
Anytime it is an accident, and also one people die, for me is a big accident.
Worldwide, hundreds of ATR-72s cross the skies each day.
Those aircraft have a very sound structure and robust systems and are very cost efficient.
Together, Panetta and Caldarelli set out to find why both engines on such an advanced airplane died in mid-flight.
TUI 1153, we have lost both engines.
Before it happens again.
Captain Garvey, how are you?
I'm getting better, thank you.
Investigators want to know what happened in the cockpit of Tuninter Flight 1153 when the engines died. Without the cockpit voice recorder, they must rely on the recollections of surviving passengers and crew members.
The main cause of double engine failure could be a lack of fuel.
But according to Captain Shafiq Garbi, lack of fuel was not the problem.
What were your fuel readings?
The fuel quantity indicator said 1,800 kilograms of fuel.
What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Fuel supply, check.
Was there any warning that you were low on fuel?
There was definitely no low fuel warning. Just a low feed pressure light.
The absence of a low fuel warning and the presence of a low feed pressure warning is a major clue.
This set of alarms usually indicates that there is a problem in feeding the engine with fuel.
Since the plane's gauges indicated that there was fuel on board that did not get to the engines, ATR's Giuseppe Caldarelli looks for flaws in the fallen plane's fuel delivery system. Four years earlier, an Airbus operated by Air Transat developed a leak in the fuel line that feeds the plane's right engine. Over time, the plane leaked all of its fuel and both engines failed. The pilots were forced to glide their plane to an emergency landing. That incident has a lot of similarities to the Tuninter crash. Giuseppe Caldarelli's team looks for breaks or blockages in the fuel lines and evidence that the fuel pumps malfunctioned and stopped fuel flow to the engines. While Caldarelli waits for technicians to complete tests on pumps and lines, Panetta decides to start a new line of inquiry. He explores the possibility that the fuel that was on board was somehow contaminated.
Fuel contamination can derive from 4 or 5 different sources.
Kerosene-based jet fuel is very delicate. If stored or transferred improperly, it can be polluted with water, sand or fungus, even sticky residue from the hoses of refueling tankers. Any of these could prevent the fuel from properly igniting and could have caused the engines to shut down.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
The plane last took on fuel in Bari. Samples from the tanker that supplied it are taken for testing. Panetta needs to prove that one of these contaminants got into Flight 1153's fuel, prevented combustion, and caused both engines to fail.
Sediments can be transferred from the tanker truck to the aircraft. So the fuel filter can be clogged, and so the engine can have some problem.
Technicians remove the truck's fuel filters to look for evidence of contamination. Hoses and couplings are swabbed for sticky residue or colonies of microorganisms and submitted for testing at an Italian Air Force laboratory. The fuel is filtered for minute particles suspended in the fluid. And carefully examined for impurities. The truck's filters are also inspected for residue or sediment from the tanks. Meanwhile, in Palermo, Caldarelli and his technicians have completed tests on Flight 1153's fuel lines and pumps. The tests are thorough, the results conclusive.
The fuel feed line were okay, were no leak.
If the fuel delivery system was working, and the two pilots remember having ample fuel,
the fuel quantity indicator said 1,800 kilograms of fuel.
Then why had the engines failed? When test results from the Bari fuel tanker come in, they too are conclusive. The fuel filters, hose couplings, and tanker fuel at Bari Airport are clean.
So fuel contamination as a source of double engine flame out was then excluded.
At this point, the investigators still don't know what caused the downing of Tuninter Flight 1153. But something has been eating at Panetta. If the plane was filled with fuel, and since the fuel is stored in the plane's wings, why did the wing section float?
Floating on the wing indicates that the weight of the wing was not so high. We have been told by ATR that if the amount of fuel that was supposed to be into the wing, around 2,000 kilograms, were on the fuel tanks, the wings maybe would not be able to float.
Panetta suspects the plane didn't have as much fuel as the pilots thought, but he doesn't know how that could be. 2 weeks into the investigation, Panetta gets an important lead in the case.
After 2 weeks of the event, we received some technical documentation from the aircraft operator.
According to the logs, Captain Garbi flew the same aircraft the day before the accident. After that flight, he reported a problem with his fuel gauge.
When he left the aircraft the day before, he reported that the right display float indicator was out of service, so it needed to be replaced.
The fuel quantity indicator, or FQI, is a gas gauge that tells pilots how much fuel is left on board. The lights on the FQI were malfunctioning, and Captain Garbi made a note of this in the maintenance log.
We were able to see that the fuel quantity indicator was changed the day before the event.
The maintenance log raises the possibility that the FQI that the mechanic installed was not the right one for the plane. It doesn't seem to have the right model number. Tuninter flies two models of ATR aircraft, the ATR-42 and the larger ATR-72. The fuel quantity indicators for each plane look identical, except for a different model number at the top of each unit. The ATR-72 should have a model number 2500. But according to the logs, mechanics installed a unit with the model number 2250 instead. Tuninter's maintenance logs offer a valuable clue. But for Panetta, there's no definitive proof that the wrong fuel quantity indicator was installed on the plane.
It could have been a mismatch in that aircraft documentation, so we need to prove that.
There is only one way to know for certain whether Flight 1153 had the right fuel quantity indicator. Go find it at the bottom of the sea.
We need, of course, to recover the wreckage from bottom of the aircraft to physically see what was the fuel quantity indicator installed on the aircraft.
Not until 3 weeks after the crash do investigators recover wreckage from the sea. The data from the plane's black boxes confirms what the pilots have been saying. There was no warning of low fuel, so there appeared to be enough fuel to make the flight. The black boxes can't solve this mystery. Investigators hope that the tail and front section can. They are hauled aboard a naval vessel from the sea. The moment the cockpit is hauled in, Panetta is there. There's only one thing he wants to see inside.
So when the wreckage was recovered from under the sea and put on the ship deck, I realized that, as a matter of fact, the fuel quantity indicator for an ATR-42 was installed. It was like we found the smoking gun.
The wrong FQI was installed on Flight 1153. Panetta finally has the break he's been looking for. The ATR's fuel quantity indicator collects data from sensors in the fuel tanks and calculates how much fuel is in the tanks. But since the fuel tanks on the 42 and the 72 are a different size, fuel quantity indicators can't be swapped between them. Technicians conduct refueling tests with the wrong FQI installed on an ATR 72. And the results are chilling.
The results show that if you install an FQI type, we say 42, on an ATR 72 aircraft, if I have no fuel into the aircraft in the fuel tanks, with it zero fuel, the fuel quantity indicator will show me 1,800 kilograms.
Precisely the amount of fuel that the captain reported having when his engines flamed out.
Cockpit fuel quantity 1,800 kilograms.
Investigators conclude, at 23,000 feet above the Mediterranean, the wrong fuel indicator led the crew to believe that they had ample fuel, when their tanks were actually empty.
Engine relight. Negative. They're not doing anything.
The engines could not possibly have been restarted. With hundreds of ATR 42s and ATR 72s still flying, the implications are stark. Could there be other planes flying with the wrong gauge?
The first safety recommendation was to mandate all operators that use ATR 42 and 72 aircraft in their fleet to check whether the right fuel quantity indicator was installed on the aircraft.
Panetta and Caldarelli have uncovered the error that caused both of Flight 1153's engines to quit in mid-air. But the case isn't closed. Standard flight procedures should have uncovered the error before takeoff and prevented the disaster. Captain Garbie's aircraft went in for repairs in Tunisia the night before the crash. The plane's FQI indicated 790 kilograms of fuel in the tank. After the new fuel quantity indicator was installed, it showed that there was almost 4 times as much fuel on board, 3,100 kilograms. The following morning, Captain Garbie noticed that the fuel levels had gone up. He assumed the fuel had been added. But when fuel is added to an aircraft, a refueling slip must be left in the cockpit.
Where is the refueling slip?
The pilot asked to the flight dispatcher where was this refueling slip, but the flight dispatcher was not able to find this refueling slip.
I'll get it to you when you get back from Jerba.
Roger that.
There was no refueling slip because the plane hadn't been refueled. In spite of regulations, the captain left without that vital piece of paper.
There are some standard regulations requiring the pilot to take off only when he is sure about the quantity of fuel.
With the wrong fuel indicator on board and less fuel than he believed, Captain Garbie makes it to Bari, Italy, and tops up his plane for the next leg of the trip to Jerba.
How much fuel are you adding?
400 kilograms.
2,700 total?
Believing he has 2,700 kilograms of fuel on board, Captain Garbie begins his flight to Jerba. If the correct fuel quantity indicator had been installed, the captain would have known that he had only 540 kilograms. Not nearly enough to make the crossing.
Mayday! 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 TUI 1153 request immediate landing at Palermo. We've lost both engines.
Panetta's investigation comes to a close. He draws up his final report. His colleague, Giuseppe Caldarelli, voices a bold view. Even with no fuel and dead engines, Flight 1153 could have made it to land.
The aircraft was in a position that allowed to reach Palermo.
TUI 1153.
Caldarelli wonders if the pilots did everything they could have to get the plane safely to Palermo.
TUI 1153.
Investigators get some unexpected answers by having seasoned pilots fly the exact same flight with the exact same problems.
Okay, we are now in big trouble because the second engine has gone off,
Vincenzo Panetta's investigation into the crash of Tuninter Flight 1153 has uncovered the events that led up to the accident. Now he and Giuseppe Caldarelli need to resolve one question. Did mistakes made by the pilots cost people their lives?
We're not going to make it.
Prepare to ditch.
Caldarelli and his team study the plane's specifications and draw a surprising conclusion. Flight 1153 could have been able to glide to Palermo. According to manufacturer data, an ATR is able to glide 3 miles for every 1,000 feet of descent. With the help of the tailwind that day, Flight 1153 could have been able to glide 70 miles to Palermo. The crew might have been able to make it.
Landing gear lever up.
So what had the pilots done wrong? To answer that question, Panetta and Caldarelli recreate Flight 1153 in the flight simulator at the ATR facility in France. Test pilots try to glide an ATR-72 for 70 miles from the altitude at which Flight 1153 lost its second engine.
The simulation was requested to see the range of the aircraft starting from the second engine out.
Double engine flame out, you have to be very aware of the configuration of the aircraft in order to keep as much as possible the altitude and distance to fly before the crash.
Stop! Stop. Engine number 1 is flamed out.
With both engines out, the priority is to keep the plane gliding as far as necessary. To do that, pilots can change the angle of their windmilling propellers.
You have the maximum glide performance when you minimize the drag. And it's very important to feather the propeller in order to reduce the drag.
Feathering the props involves changing their angle against the wind. The maneuver reduces drag.
When you want to feather the propeller in flight, you first have to reduce the power lever to idle and put the condition lever back to feather position.
The crew did not feather their props when their engines quit. The windmilling propellers created enormous drag. If the crew of Flight 1153 had feathered their props, they may have been able to glide further than they did.
Let's get to 17,000 feet.
By the time Captain Godby's second engine flamed out, he was just below 22,000 feet. To further reduce drag at that altitude, the plane should be slowed to 158 miles per hour, the ATR-72's ideal gliding speed. Surprisingly, to glide as far as possible, a pilot doesn't want to fly as fast as possible. The faster a plane flies, the more the airflow pushes against it, creating resistance. Every plane has an optimal speed to achieve the furthest glide. The crew continued flying up to 55 miles an hour faster than their optimal gliding speed. That added to the drag on the plane and reduced the distance they could glide. By feathering his props and reducing his speed, a simulator pilot in France was able to get the plane as far as Palermo.
You're with me, Ellie, huh? Careful.
Flight 1153 hit the water 26 miles from shore, well short of what the plane was capable of achieving. The simulation confirmed that the crew might have been able to make it to land.
It was theoretically possible to reach the coast, but it was also very difficult to achieve that result.
Simulator pilots had one big advantage over the crew of Flight 1153. They weren't in a life or death situation, and they knew they had to glide instead.
Fuel supply, check.
But Captain Garbi didn't know he was out of fuel. He didn't think he'd need to glide to Palermo. Garbi focused on restarting the engines instead. Feathering the props isn't part of that procedure. If the captain had known he was out of fuel, he might have acted to maximize glide instead. Once he realized that his engines wouldn't start, his focus was on trying to find a place to ditch the plane. Captain Garbi also had to contend with a lack of instruments, as well as radio interruptions.
TY 1153. What is your fuel load?
Cockpit fuel quantity, 1,800 kilograms.
Most importantly, Captain Garbi had the lives of his 34 passengers to consider.
Of course, it's much easier to cope with that kind of situation on the simulator, because if you do wrong, if you crash the aircraft, you have the magic button, right, reset, everything is okay again. And that's very different in the real life with passengers behind and when it's your life.
Your distance is now 20 miles.
We're not going to make it.
The simulation highlights the importance of proper training to deal with unlikely situations, such as a twin-engine flameout.
In aviation, it's a very rare event.
Vincenzo Panetta's report urges airlines to train their pilots how to ditch without engine power. Better pilot training is just one of 17 safety recommendations in the accident report. Perhaps the most important, that ATR redesigned the fuel quantity indicator.
In order to prevent a fuel quantity indicator type 42 on a 72 aircraft and vice versa.
To prevent mechanics from installing the incorrect part, Panetta believes that the only answer is to design the FQIs so that they only fit on the plane they're meant for. 9 men faced charges of criminal negligence for the downing of Flight 1153, including the Tuninter mechanic who installed the wrong FQI, and Captain Garbi.
I'll get it to you when you get back from Jerba.
Roger that.
There is no single cause of the accident. This accident, like many other aircraft accidents, was determined by a series of action, a series of events linked one to each other.
È inaudita una cosa del genere.
This is unheard of.
Avrei accettato di più se si fosse rotto un motore.
I would have accepted the engine breaking or a window shattering. But to have people die because of a lack of fuel?
Persone perché manca di carburante su un aereo.
Per evitare che si possano ripetere altre
We remember this to avoid such other tragedies, so that when you board a plane, you don't have to endure anything. Not even the simplest things.
semplici, perché sono quelle cose più semplici che si potrebbero evitare.
Because it is the simple things that can be avoided. Tragic events like this should not happen.
Dei disastri così gravi.
Attempt to restart the engine.
The crash of Flight 1153 was caused by a series of grave errors on the ground and in the air. But the flight data recorder does show that the crew's last move before hitting the water was absolutely perfect.
Here we go.
According to the available evidences, the flight data recorder and also some statement released by the crew that survived, the aircraft touched the sea first with the rear part of the aircraft at an altitude which is compatible with the optimum pitch altitude of the aircraft, which is 9 degrees.
Captain Garbi raised the plane's nose up to 9 degrees at the last possible moment. So instead of plowing into the sea, his plane glided along the surface of the water. The maneuver likely saved lives by allowing more passengers to escape the ruined aircraft. His flying may have prevented this accident from becoming an even greater tragedy. It's a few days before Christmas. The residents of a small Scottish town prepare for the holidays. Danger is fast approaching.
The street was on fire, lawns were on fire, and houses were on fire.
I had never seen anything like that.
Christmas is just going to be remembered for all the wrong reasons.
A devastating plane crash shatters a village and captures the attention of the world.
It was one of the most significant terrorist attacks in history.
The mystery is finally cracked by a piece of debris smaller than a fingertip. October the 26th, 1988, near Dusseldorf. For weeks, German police have been following a group of suspected terrorists around the ancient town of Neuss. Today, they'll make their move. In the trunk of their car, police make an unusual discovery.
Berühren Sie es nicht.
Police raid apartments used by the two men. They find a number of blank passports and a small arsenal of weapons. When police closely examine the radio recovered from their car, they find it's wired with explosives.
Those devices used a combination of an improvised barometric device and a timer, a short delay timer. All these devices were, in fact, supposed to go onto an aircraft.
A barometric timer is set off by changes in altitude. It's triggered when it reaches a certain height. Since that guarantees a plane will be in the air when the bomb goes off, it's a favorite device for those targeting passenger jets. The two men arrested in Germany work for a well-known terrorist organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Leader of the PFLP-GC, Ahmed Jibril, made a speech in Libya in 1986, and one of the things he said was that until there's peace in the Middle East, there would be no safety for anyone traveling on an American or an Israeli airliner.
Hafez Dalkamouni is shipping weapons to Syria and Lebanon. Marwan Krishat is a notorious bomb maker, responsible for bringing down at least one passenger jet. It's just a couple of months until the busy Christmas travel season. With the two men under arrest, German police have made commercial aviation a little safer. Two months later, Pan Am Flight 103 is on its way from London to New York. The jet has just taken off from Heathrow Airport. There are 259 people on board. Most of the passengers are American. Charles McKee actually works for the US government. Khalid Jafar lives in Detroit and is returning home from a trip to Lebanon and Germany. The first part of the trip to the United States takes the plane northwest up over Scotland. The so-called Daventry departure is one of 6 preset routes that jets follow on their way out of Heathrow. Lockerbie is one of several small towns the plane will pass over. Tucked away in the Scottish lowlands, residents are barely aware that they live below a busy aerial highway. Pan Am calls this 747 Clipper Made of the Seas. As it levels off at 31,000 feet, the crew gets in touch with air traffic control.
Good evening, Scottish. Clipper 103, we are level at 310.
103, you are identified.
Captain James Macquarie is 55 years old. Like many passengers on this pre-holiday flight, he's heading home. Five miles below, the people of Lockerbie prepare for Christmas. Michael Gordon is chatting with a friend when a strange rumbling noise fills his house.
Hang on, there's something odd outside here.
The weather that night was a bit wild. There was a fairly strong westerly wind, and I could hear it hitting the window in front of me. From my window I can see Lockerbie because my house sits up on the hill. And I heard this noise which was above the noise of the wind, and the noise sounded like thunder. And the noise got louder and louder. And I could hear the noise then got to the stage of being similar to a jet fighter. And at that time, we had a lot of military aircraft passing through the area. However, I saw dark objects, dark things falling from the sky. Against the lights of Lockerbie, I could see these black objects coming down. And then, from my right, quite high on my right, I could see a long, thin, black object which had a fire on the upper surface coming in. And it was making its way towards Lockerbie. When it hit, there was the most horrendous explosion, and I could hear the tiles on the roof of my house lifting.
Hello? Hello?
When the explosion took place, the telephone line stopped functioning.
Lockerbie is burning. Enormous flames reach into the night sky. Michael Gordon races to the neighborhood that is hardest hit.
The street was on fire, the lawns were on fire, and houses were on fire. And it was difficult to go without finding my trousers burning and my shoes burning. You had to jump about quite a bit because everything was on fire. But I remember at that point finding an airline ticket, and it was perfectly intact. There's no damage by fire or fuel or contamination of any sort. And the airline ticket said London Heathrow to JFK.
Somehow, Pan Am Flight 103 has fallen from the sky and smashed into Lockerbie, Scotland. In the daylight, the full horror of the crash of Pan Am Flight 103 is obvious. Several houses on the ground have simply vanished, vaporized when the plane smashed into them. An enormous crater is torn through the southern edge of the town. 1,500 tons of rock and earth have been blasted out of the ground. 11 people from Lockerbie are dead, along with all 259 people who were on board.
As far as I know, I've lost my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and their house is just a 30-foot crater.
In the ruins of their homes, they search for the bodies of the aircraft's passengers. Such a catastrophe, so sudden, so great a shock for a quiet town.
It looked like a scene out of hell. This whole road was ablaze.
Didn't know what it was, and then we rushed outside and just all this debris coming down.
Air crash investigators have arrived in Lockerbie within hours of the crash. Mick Charles is the lead inspector for the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, the AAIB.
One of the first sites we went to was the site of the crater that was still smelling very much of aviation fuel for a start, and scattered all around were bits of debris and in some cases human tissue as well.
Charles quickly gathers his team to begin looking for clues.
It was all heaving, it was happening, there were loads of people, and it was to some extent chaos.
You'll be organised into groups, headed by an AAIB inspector. Does anyone have any questions? The sooner we start, the better.
More than 1,000 police officers and 600 members of the military pour into Lockerbie.
You always have this sense of wanting to get to grips with what it is. It was quite clear that whatever it was colossal.
Any debris that's found is put into clear plastic bags and left to be collected later. Dark bags are used to store human remains. It's just days before Christmas, but the holiday spirit has been shattered.
At the start of the investigation, what we were doing was finding out which bits of the aeroplane were where, actually finding all the aeroplane.
The sheer scale of the disaster is difficult to comprehend.
Chris, the RAF have offered us a helicopter. Can we use it?
Absolutely.
With so much wreckage being found, investigators need to get a bird's-eye view and locate the largest fields of debris.
The maps of that area were a very short supply, and we ran out of them very quickly, so we had to use black and white photocopies initially.
Investigators bring local police officer Michael Gordon with them to help in the search.
The intention was for me to be able to identify geographical landmarks and identify parts of the aircraft.
They soon get a better sense of their enormous task.
When we were in the helicopter, we could see that the wreckage came out in a cone shape, emanating from Lockerbie, and the cone shape got wider and wider the further from Lockerbie.
The principal feature that I was looking for was to try to establish some pattern of the wreckage which would basically help me direct the ground investigators.
They're shocked by what they find. Pieces of the plane are scattered over an area larger than all of London. More than 2,000 square kilometers. It quickly becomes clear that Pan Am 103 was coming apart long before it hit the ground.
Normally, you're seeing a fairly contained accident site. In Lockerbie, it was nothing like that, because initially the police had identified half a dozen discrete sites.
A 747 is made up of more than 6 million parts. In the mangled remains of the jet, investigators need to find the one that will tell them what happened. The plane's cockpit is eerie proof that Pan Am Flight 103 broke apart in mid-air. Severed from the rest of the plane, it's 4 kilometers east of the city.
When looking at the cockpit, I was looking at the roof of it, and the windows were intact. The actual nose part had cracked open, but it was as if it had been chopped off just aft of the cabin, and you could walk around the back and look into the cabin section from the back.
Inside the cockpit, investigators note the positions of various switches and controls. They find the autopilot is on and the oxygen masks are still stowed.
This is a fairly standard procedure which we would do in any such investigation. The end result was that there was nothing at all untoward found in the cockpit. Everything was consistent with cruising flight.
Soon, investigators discover why the damage to Lockerbie was so devastating.
The main wreckage which fell on the town of Lockerbie was the wing, which is basically both the left and right wing, complete with a structure in the middle.
Investigators estimate that the plane was loaded down with 90,000 kilograms of fuel.
$150 tons, descending essentially vertically at up to about 500 knots speed, and there's an awful lot of energy in that. And that's what created the crater.
To find the cause of the crash, however, investigators will have to look elsewhere. They need to examine wreckage found south of Lockerbie. These pieces would have come off at the beginning of the disaster. While the painstaking work of collecting evidence continues, investigators comb through maintenance records. Those records raise concerns with the plane's age. Clipper Made of the Seas was the 15th 747 ever built by Boeing.
This was one of the older Boeing 747s. It was built in 1970, so it was 18 years old and had got something like 75,000 flying hours.
Perhaps some critical part of the plane had given way as it flew over Lockerbie.
The two obvious possibilities were that it was a straightforward structural failure, or it was possibly the result of sabotage.
McCharles, Tom Thurman, FBI.
Good to meet you, Tom. I was expecting you.
While the investigators are searching for possible answers in the history of the plane, the second possibility, sabotage, is also being pursued.
We were there to provide technical expertise to the Scottish investigators into explosives and explosive damage, and that the telltale sign that it could be a bomb.
Just 3.5 years before Lockerbie, a bomb had brought down an Air India jet just off the Irish coast. In that case, the plane and vital clues sunk deep to the bottom of the sea. But the wreckage of the Pan Am flight litters the Scottish lowlands. If it was a bomb, there's a chance that important evidence can be found.
What kind of logistical effort is it going to take to find everything, and I mean everything, and bring it back to a location to be able to look at it and come to some conclusion? With the fragments that we found on the ground, we were picking those up. We were looking for blast damage on these pieces of metal. But until we found something that said it was a bomb, physical evidence, it was an accident.
We were very mindful of the fact that there was plenty of reports in the media about it being a terrorist act. It's a question of what evidence you find and which direction to take the investigation.
In the first 24 hours, 4 separate groups have claimed responsibility for bombing the jet.
The guardians of the Islamic Revolution are undertaking this heroic execution in revenge for the blowing of the Iranian airplane by America.
Dick Marquise is an expert on international terrorism working for the American FBI.
A number of organizations either claim credit for or were given credit, including groups from Iran and Palestinian groups, and one Irish group also claimed responsibility for it.
6 months earlier, the US Navy shot down an Iranian passenger jet. 290 people were killed. The American government claims it was an accident, but Iran has vowed revenge. Other threats had been made in the weeks before the crash. The American embassy in Helsinki received an anonymous warning that a bomb would soon be put on a Pan Am flight leaving from Frankfurt. Officials eventually discounted the threat, but a notice was posted in American embassies. Many of the passengers who boarded Flight 103 had come from Frankfurt on a connecting flight.
Right, excellent work, everyone.
Then, on Christmas Eve, just 3 days after the crash of the plane, the investigation gets an enormous break.
Everyone clear on what they need to do this evening? Terrific. Tom, can I see you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You'd like to put your gloves on, I think, for this.
Mick Charles had a bag and had a piece of metal in the bag.
What is it?
We think it's a piece of luggage rail. It helps guide the cargo containers into place.
Inspectors in the field discovered items which they recognized as being not part of a normal failure sequence that you would expect if it had been a structural failure.
Nick, this has been very near an explosion.
That's what we thought as well.
Small marks have been made on the metal. Craters that are the telltale signs of a bomb.
The hot gases of the combustion process of the explosion hits a piece of particularly metal, and it puts pits in it like you would take a blowtorch. Take a blowtorch and you have a piece of metal and you just barely touch the piece of metal, it'll make a little hole down into the metal.
It's the first piece of wreckage from outside the town of Lockerbie to show any signs of being damaged by fire.
Where did you find it?
I'll take you out in the morning.
The Scottish countryside is about to become the largest crime scene in the world. It's Christmas Day, 1988. But in Lockerbie, Scotland, people are still reeling from a devastating plane crash.
Christmas is just going to be remembered for all the wrong reasons.
It's just tragic for everybody. I'll never believe in God again.
For air crash investigators, December the 25th is treated like any other day at work.
That was, in my mind, the most distinguishing characteristic of Lockerbie. And although it was over Christmas, you just stay there and you do what you have to do.
Investigators converge on a farmer's field outside of the town.
Over here! Keep yelling! We can't see you!
The weather had turned horrible. Foggy, kind of misting rain. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. And there was debris literally all over the place.
Another piece of the baggage compartment rail has been found.
That looks like the piece that you showed me last night. About 20 inches is just gone.
And lo and behold, that was the other piece of the skid rail that was literally sticking in the ground. We made some photographs. You know, it was a Christmas present that we could go out there to this farm and find the other piece of metal that had been blown off. No, we were not fascinated. We were pumped.
This piece also has pits and craters in it, indications that it was close to an explosion. The pieces of wreckage are part of the southern debris field, and near the beginning of it. The placement suggests they were some of the first parts to break off the plane.
We were very suspicious that it was a bomb which had caused this destruction, but we were not prepared to say anything until we'd had those details confirmed by the forensic experts.
A British forensics lab has made the critical link. Traces of 2 chemicals used to make plastic explosive are found on the debris recovered near Lockerbie. On December the 28th, just 7 days after the crash, investigators have their proof and announce it to the world.
It has been established that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallets framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive.
The crash of Pan Am Flight 103 is now officially a crime.
Our mandate with regard to Lockerbie was find out who did it and prove it. Because what we wanted to do is bring someone to justice and make them answer for killing 270 people.
With terrorism now the official cause, rumors start to fly. Speculation eventually focuses on two passengers. Charles McKee works for the US Department of Defense.
Charles McGee was returning from the Middle East, where he was working trying to free hostages that had been taken in the Middle East during the mid-1980s.
The hostages McKee was trying to release were being held in Lebanon. In 1988, a civil war was tearing that country apart. Americans were seen as useful bargaining chips.
There was speculation in the media that Charles McKee may have been targeted by terrorists because of the work he was doing.
McKee isn't the only passenger who captures the attention of the media. Khalid Jafar was 20 years old and was returning home to the US after a trip to Lebanon and Germany.
Perhaps a bomb was carried on board an aircraft by someone who may have had a Middle Eastern-sounding name. Jafar was examined as a potential suspect.
The story makes it as far as the US Congress, but no proof can be found that Jafar was involved or that McKee was the intended target.
We looked at every single passenger on the plane to see if, in fact, someone could have given them a bomb. The evidence proved that not to be the case.
In Lockerbie, investigators from the AAIB continue to sort through the tons of tangled metal.
We could, I suppose in theory, have just stopped, but we thought, we know it's a bomb, we have all of the wreckage over land, it's an ideal opportunity to recover it all and to understand it properly. We knew it was a small bomb, but we didn't understand the explosive processes.
Investigators are particularly interested in the hull of the aircraft. They move pieces of it to a military hangar just outside of town.
It was a 5-acre shed which was long enough that we could plan to lay the fuselage out, opened up like a clamshell, using the bottom center line of the aircraft as our sort of core line.
The fuselage of an airplane is bolted to a series of frames, and each frame is numbered based on how far it is from the front of the aircraft.
Before we laid out the wreckage two-dimensionally, we put lines and tapes on the floor to give us a grid, and this grid related to the geometry of the aeroplane.
They begin to reassemble it, like an enormous jigsaw puzzle.
A lot of the structure bears characteristic shapes that you can say immediately, this looks like a door frame. A lot of stuff, it has unique part numbers, which can help you identify small and fairly, what you would call, unidentifiable bits.
As the work continues, more pieces of the plane are found that show telltale blast damage.
Right, the location is 817204.
When they gather the pieces that are near the front of the plane, investigators make a chilling discovery. This is where the bomb had started ripping the plane apart.
It became apparent that there was an area of the aircraft in which the damage was really quite different from the rest.
The fuselage in this section isn't torn, but blasted to pieces.
The fuselage structure in the area of the explosion was blackened and sooted. The fractures were very rapid and jagged, unlike normal tearing fractures of skin.
Frame 700 runs right round here.
Not only do investigators now know it was a bomb, they know where it blasted through the fuselage of the plane. Just outside of the forward luggage compartment. Peter Claydon is responsible for reassembling the cargo containers that were directly behind the shatter zone.
The main goal I had was to identify the baggage container that contained the device. We had maybe 20 baggage containers of a similar construction. So it's like having 20 jigsaw puzzles all mixed up.
The investigators concentrate on the cargo containers that were found in the southern debris field, wreckage that was ejected shortly after the explosion.
We concluded that there were only two on the aircraft, one made of aluminium, one made of fiberglass, and they had been adjacent to each other on the aircraft, and they were the only two that exhibited evidence of an improvised explosive device having detonated.
The metal container, AVE 4041, is of particular interest. It was resting directly behind frame 700, where the blast damage is the worst.
The damage caused to the metal container was quite severe. The damage to the adjacent fiberglass container, I think you might call it collateral damage.
Investigators create a simple framework and attach the pieces of the real cargo container to it. As they do, it becomes clear. AVE 4041 carried the bomb that brought the plane down. Closely examining damage to the floor and the side of the container, investigators are also able to pinpoint the height of the bomb, where it was in the container when it exploded.
What that said to me was that the device was probably in a suitcase, and that suitcase was probably not on the floor of the container. It looked like it was one level up.
According to luggage records, it means that the bag containing the bomb had come from a connecting flight. While investigators are assembling a piece of the metal container, they discover a fragment of wreckage that doesn't belong.
When I was looking at it, I saw a little piece of debris trapped in one of the folds. So gently flexing this apart, it fell out. When I looked at it, I could see it was a fragment of a printed circuit board, an electronic circuit board.
Can you bring me a camera and an evidence bag, please? Let's get this to the lab.
I didn't know whether it was a bomb, part of the airplane really, or what. It could have been somebody's shaver, for all I know.
Eventually, forensic experts in Britain determined that the circuit board was a piece of a specific brand of radio. News of the discovery makes its way to Washington. It reaches Tom Thurman, who's returned to his office there.
And lo and behold, an identification was made into a Toshiba SF-16 radio. And ironically enough, the name on the side of that radio, just as a brand name, I guess, was called a bomb beat radio.
The radio cassette player had hidden the bomb. It's very similar to the one that was recovered by German police when they cracked the Palestinian terrorist cell 2 months before the bombing. Had German police somehow missed something? Had a bomb made here been used on the Pan Am flight?
When the bombing happened, one of the initial suspects certainly was the PFL-PGC cell in Germany. The intelligence told us that the PFL-PGC was probably responsible for this.
49 passengers who eventually boarded the Pan Am flight started their journey in the German city of Frankfurt. Their bags were placed onto Flight 103 in London. But the airline did not ensure the passengers who checked in the bags actually got onto the plane. Perhaps a bomb made in Germany had slipped through the cracks at Heathrow while the terrorist walked away.
We had to then, if that was the case, prove it.
As the investigation continues, there's a puzzling discovery. While made by the same company, the cassette player used in the Lockerbie bombing is slightly different from the one that was seized in Germany.
Both were contained into Toshiba radios, but one was a one-speaker model, and the one that blew up the Lockerbie plane was a two-speaker, more updated model radio.
The difference in the model of radio being used raises doubts. Perhaps the terrorists in Germany are not responsible.
You can look at the way that a device is put together and say, hey, I know who put this together because I've seen this before, and this is the way that this bomb builder puts a bomb together. To call it a bomber's signature.
Law enforcement officials need more clues to figure out who had built the bomb. Perhaps the suitcase it was packed in can provide those clues. Studying small pieces of wreckage, British forensic experts find that the suitcase was a hard-sided Samsonite 4000. Samsonite made only a few thousand of these suitcases and sold all of them in the Middle East. Several pieces of clothing have also been identified that were very close to the explosion, likely in the suitcase that concealed the bomb. Most of these clothes were made by a single manufacturer and were only sold on the tiny island of Malta.
So Malta became the focus of the investigation because of the manufacture and eventually distribution of some of the clothing that was found at Lockerbie.
Investigators find the shop in Malta where the clothes were sold. The owner gives them another clue.
The key thing that he told us was the person had a Libyan accent, something we didn't really have evidence yet that tied Libya to the bombing.
It was just 2 weeks before the attack on the Pan Am flight. In 1988, Libya was reeling from a number of confrontations with the American military. Economic sanctions had been imposed. The country was isolated, and its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, aggressively anti-American. Perhaps the bombing of the Pan Am flight was an attack by Libya against the United States. Pouring through baggage records for the Pan Am flight, police discover one piece of luggage that had been carried from Malta to Frankfurt earlier that day. Bag number B8849 had then been sent through to Britain's Heathrow Airport. Once there, it was placed on the second level of cargo container AVE 4041. It was the Samsonite case investigators now know carried the bomb. More than a year after the crash, a new discovery in Lockerbie helps simplify the confusing series of clues. Forensic experts discover another circuit board from among the clothes that came from Malta.
It doesn't come from that circuit board that was in the SF-16 radio. And this circuit board is half the size of your thumbnail.
A photo of the circuit board is sent to Tom Thurman. He believes it could be a piece of the timer from the bomb.
I spent months literally looking through all of the files of the FBI on other examinations that we had conducted over many, many, many years.
The FBI has photos of timers used to detonate bombs around the world. But Thurman can't find any that match the piece found at Lockerbie.
Nope. Next.
After a period, I ran out of leads. And at that point, decided, okay, now we need to go outside the physical FBI laboratory.
Thurman eventually takes the photo of the circuit to the Central Intelligence Agency.
I called a contact of mine and I said, I need to bring something over for you to look at.
Sifting through reports on various bombings, Thurman finds a match.
Wait a second. That could be the same. Do you have this timer?
When Thurman closely examines the timer captured by the CIA, he's stunned.
Within a few minutes, literally, I started getting cold chills. And right now, as I talk about it, cold chills start on me, because I can still see that moment so vividly in my mind that I'm looking at circuit track that's just like what I'm seeing in the photograph.
This is what we're looking for.
The timer the CIA has was seized in Africa a few years earlier. 2 Libyan men were trying to get it and several pounds of explosives past airport security. It's identical to the timer used to bring down Flight 103 and wouldn't be set off by changes in pressure like the barometric switch discovered in Germany. This device was set to go off at a certain time, not at a given altitude.
This is the timer. This is a long delay timer that brought down that aircraft. But now we want to know, okay, where'd this come from?
The Lockerbie bomb used a different timer and a different radio than the bomb found in Germany. Someone else was behind the destruction of the jet.
This was not made in somebody's home laboratory. This was a extremely professionally made timer.
While the criminal investigation becomes murkier, the accident investigation is becoming increasingly clear. The investigation eventually moves from Scotland to Farnborough, England. Well known for its aeronautics industry, the town is home to the AAIB. Several months after the crash of Pan Am Flight 103, investigators launch a massive endeavor. They begin to rebuild a 20-meter section of the fuselage from the ruined jet. They hope that it would give them information their two-dimensional reconstruction couldn't. They can see that the explosion tore a 1.5 by 5 meter hole in the side of the plane. Chris Prothero is a senior inspector of air accidents at the AAIB.
What was very difficult to understand was the fact that this area of direct damage was effectively a pinprick in relation to the size of the aircraft as a whole, and it was very difficult to understand how this pinprick of damage had resulted in such a comprehensive destruction of the aircraft.
The bomb that brought the plane down had less than 0.5 kilogram of explosive. Yet its destructive power was immense. Investigators want to learn more about how shock waves behave inside a jet.
It's rather like a freeze frame on a video footage. If you can capture that point as the thing is coming apart, it tells you a great deal about the way it's coming apart.
What they discover is that the initial blast wave wasn't the only one to damage the plane. A large section of the ceiling of the aircraft has been pushed up with so much force that the rivets connecting it to the plane's frame popped. It wasn't torn apart, but blasted by a shockwave.
The other features that the 3D reconstruction allowed us to identify were areas of remote pressure damage on the crown skin and other areas where explosive shock had been channeled through the internal spaces in the aircraft.
The inside of a jet acts like an echo chamber, bouncing the shockwaves of the bomb around. They gather strength until they encounter a weak spot in the skin. When they do, they blast through. The work in Farnborough is powerful proof of how destructive even a small bomb can be. How vital it is to track the bombers down. Almost 2 years after the Lockerbie disaster, the criminal trail of evidence brings investigators to Zurich. The timer that detonated the bomb is traced to a Swiss company called Nebo. One of the owners of the company admits to building it.
The timer was given to the Libyan government. A total of 20 of them were made, all delivered to Libyan officials.
Early in the investigation, focus was directed at the Palestinian terrorist group in Germany. Now there's growing proof that they had nothing to do with the downing of Flight 103.
There were any number of suspects, and it wasn't until we kept putting everything in one pile, and the pile kept stacking up, and it spelled Libya.
Criminal investigators have linked the timer that detonated the bomb to Libya. They know that a Libyan bought the clothes that were in the suitcase. And they know that Libya has a recent history of military confrontation with America. All they need now is the bomber himself. In 1999, they finally have him. At the time of the disaster, Abdel al-Megrahi was an intelligence officer for the Libyan government. He's arrested and charged.
He was a high-ranking Libyan official. He certainly could have access to whatever he wanted. Our investigation determined that Megrahi also had a front company at Mibo. He had been there many times. He certainly knew each other. When you start to see all the connections and these things just start fitting together, it made it easier to accept our evidence.
In 2001, Scottish judges sentenced him to life for the murder of 270 people. 2 years later, the government of Libya officially accepts responsibility for the bombing and pays $2.7 billion to the families involved. Anger is also aimed at Pan Am for the role it played in the disaster. A Scottish inquiry points a finger at the company. The passenger who checked the bomb onto Flight 103 did not get on board. It's a fact that Pan Am could have discovered had it been following proper procedures.
One of the things we discovered when we looked into the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 was that there were several bags on that plane that did not correspond to passengers.
One of the changes that came about as a result of the Air India bombing was that airlines were forced to make sure no bag was put on a plane without a passenger accompanying it. It's called passenger baggage reconciliation. Without proper notification, Pan Am had stopped matching passengers and baggage at Heathrow Airport.
So that rule that said that all passengers and luggage have to be matched was not followed.
The company was eventually found guilty of willful misconduct. After the crash and the court ruling, Pan Am declared bankruptcy. 20 years after the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, its shattered fuselage still stands in Farnborough, England. Those pieces may soon be used to train investigators here and around the world. A critical aid in case terrorists strike again.
The enduring feeling I have as a result of Lockerbie is the tremendous level of cooperation we had from all the agencies. And considering that there were about 2,500 people with the military, the police, and so on involved in this, I think that's a great tribute.
Lockerbie was a rare occasion that we felt honored to be a part of, to help make this happen. You know, we played small roles, but everybody played small roles to make big contributions to an overall success.
In the town of Lockerbie, there's little evidence today of the horror that exploded from the sky 20 years ago. In a small church, near where the dying plane's cockpit landed, is a stark reminder of the toll of terror and the importance of bringing the guilty to justice. at the chaotic end of a bitter war. The world's largest airplane is loaded with orphans and headed for safety.
Advancing throttles now.
Time. Go.
We needed to get out of missile range.
But only minutes into their escape,
there was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that?
The plane is out of control.
I kept going faster and faster and faster.
And headed for the ground.
Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
And then it was quiet.
South Vietnam, April 1975. After more than 10 years of fighting, the United States is on the verge of defeat. The end of the war is fast approaching. The enemy is closing in on the capital. On April the 4th, at a military base in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, a strange cargo is being loaded onto an enormous C-5A Galaxy. This is one of the largest planes in the world. The C-5A is primarily a cargo plane. Its hold is wide enough to carry tanks and tall enough to move buses. Above the cargo area, there's a small number of seats. Both the passenger area and the cargo bay are being pressed into service today. Dozens of Vietnamese orphans are being loaded onto the plane to be flown to safety. There are thousands of orphans to be flown out before the North Vietnamese take Saigon. Barb Adams works for the American Embassy. She and her daughter Linda are also fleeing.
On April 4th, my mom came home and told me that I had 1 hour to pack one suitcase and that we were going to be escorting the orphans on an orphan airlift back to the United States. When my mother and I went upstairs to the troop compartment, there's traditional airline seats, and all of the seats were filled with babies.
Sergeant Ray Snediger is in charge of loading the plane's massive cargo bay.
Make sure it's secure. We got people down there.
It was hard to control the situation. So many people were there, so much news media, so many people from the orphanages, so many military people, that it was actually pure chaos.
Just the day before, American President Gerald Ford announced the start of this desperate mission of mercy, a remarkable effort called Operation Baby Lift.
I have directed that C-5A aircraft and other aircraft especially equipped to care for these orphans during the flight be sent to Saigon. I expect these flights to begin within the next 36 to 48 hours.
Arnold Isaacs was covering the end of the war for the Baltimore Sun.
We had transport aircraft flying into Saigon every day, unloading military supplies and going back empty. And so it was decided that they could carry out the orphans on those returning flights. There were a lot of cameras and reporters out there covering the loading and the departure of the plane.
Captain Bud Traynor is in charge of Operation Babylift's first flight.
I got a call from the command post back in the States, and they said to me, how many people could you take out of Saigon if you were asked?
Because of the last-minute nature of the flight, they're running behind schedule. The plane is already 5 hours late, and Captain Traynor wants to be in the air. He orders the cargo bay doors to be closed.
Tell me what.
Doors closed. Loadmaster closed cargo bay doors.
The youngest of the 145 children have been crammed into the upper passenger section of the jet.
My mother and I were both assigned 3 rows of seats with maybe 4 to a row. So it would be 12 to 15 babies that we would be taking care of on the flight, feeding them, changing them, whatever they needed to have done.
Ina? Have a good flight, Ina.
There are 102 older children in the cargo area below. A number of adults from the American Embassy are also down here, keeping an eye on the orphans. Getting out of Vietnam starts by leaving the safety of the US base.
Advancing throttles now.
15. 20. Time, go.
Gear up.
I remembered that we had to take off at a pretty steep angle. And we didn't have seats, so we were to kneel on the floor between the seats during takeoff.
The cargo plane is heading for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. It's a 2.5-hour flight. From there, the orphans will be sent to adoption agencies in North America and Australia.
We needed to take off from Saigon and make a very rapid ascent to get out of missile range.
Cargo planes are easy targets. They're slow-moving and large. The possibility of an attack is very real. Just 5 days before, North Vietnamese troops captured the South's second largest city, Da Nang. South Vietnamese forces are retreating towards Saigon. In the capital, the situation is chaotic. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians are desperate to leave.
Every day, another province was lost, especially after Da Nang fell. The population of Saigon, I think, began to fall into a sort of a paralyzed, petrified terror. Never, not for one moment that I remember, did you have a feeling of anyone rallying to defend the country.
How's the air in the troop compartment?
It's all right.
The baby's still squalling, or...?
They quieted down with all the noise.
Most are asleep.
Just as well.
Then, shortly after takeoff, as the plane climbs through 23,000 feet,
when the rapid decompression occurred, the plane filled with this mist. And so until it dissipates, you cannot see.
And there was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that? And she said, I'm not sure. And you could feel the plane heading downward.
Debris started flying around.
It's a classic decompression. Somewhere there's a massive hole in the plane's fuselage. The air inside the jet is rushing out. At 23,000 feet, there's barely enough oxygen to breathe.
So I looked over at the co-pilot, and he was putting on his oxygen mask, and I thought, I'd better do that too.
The oxygen masks have dropped automatically. But on such an overcrowded flight, there aren't enough to go round. The ones that are available weren't designed to reach babies.
As I looked out the window, I saw the ocean. And I said to my mom, I said, we're crashing, aren't we?
At the back of the passenger compartment, Lieutenant Marshal Wirtz checks in with the crew. From there, she can usually see down to the cargo bay below her.
Pilot, this is Wirtz. I'm at the top grade of the troop compartment. I can see the China Sea out the rear of the plane.
What?
The cargo door is gone.
With more than 300 people on board, Captain Bud Trainor's jet has lost its breathable air. Somehow, his massive aircraft has been badly damaged. And he's a long way from a safe place to land. The inaugural flight of Operation Baby Lift will not make it out of Vietnam. The next few minutes will determine if anyone even survives. Oxygen levels are dangerously low. Unlike the passenger compartment above, there are only a few portable masks for passengers in the cargo bay.
My first priority after a rapid decompression is to get the aircraft back down to a breathing altitude for all the passengers, which is 10,000 feet.
Taking it back to the airport.
And so I turned 180 degrees, and now I'm heading back for Saigon.
But before he gets back to Saigon,
Sergeant Snedeker.
Trainer needs to know how bad the situation is.
The airplane is going down in a left bank. At that particular point, I sense that we're going down. I go to the cockpit.
Sir! See what's going on.
And Captain Trainer tells me to go to the cargo compartment to see what's happening down there.
When I was in my descent, I went to my maximum speed, which is what you're supposed to do, to get to 10,000 feet. I got to my maximum speed, and I pulled back on the yoke, and nothing happened. I kept going faster and faster and faster.
Trainer's plane is diving to the ground, and he can't get it to pull up. At the back of the plane, Ray Snedeker descends into the center of the storm.
When I came down, I noticed there was a lot of chaos in the cargo compartment. Obviously, people were frightened. So I'm actually crawling and stepping over people that are combat loaded on the floor. And I saw this huge gaping hole in the back of the airplane. All daylight back there.
And then Snedeker spots what could be an even more serious problem.
Hydraulic fluid is pumping out. Control cables are dangling in the breeze, flopping back and forth, and it just reminded me of looking at some spaghetti. That was the first thought in my mind.
The flight engineer also notices that the plane is losing its hydraulic fluid fast.
Pilot, we've lost number 1 hydraulic system. We've just lost number 2 hydraulics.
Hydraulic fluid helps the crew move the massive control surfaces on the plane. The rudder and elevator at the back, and the ailerons and flaps on the wing. There are 4 separate hydraulic systems on the plane. Now 2 of them are completely empty. And as Trainer dives towards 10,000 feet, his plane is going much faster than it should, and he can't pull up.
And I kept pulling back on the yoke, thinking that I could slow down, pull back more and more and more.
I'm not getting anything out of the yoke. How about you? Nothing.
And we were just totally puzzled. What is going wrong?
Pulling on his yoke should bring the plane's nose up and slow it down. If he can't pull the plane up soon, it'll plow straight into the ground.
And I'm concerned at that point we're still falling. We're not leveling out.
In the belly of the plane, Ray Snediger reports what he sees to the cockpit.
Pilot! Cargo bay! Go ahead.
I had told him that the part of the ramp was missing, pressure door was gone, and hydraulic lines and control cables had been cut.
The problem is now much worse than we thought.
Declare an emergency. Saigon, this is MAC 80218, and we're declaring emergency. We require immediate return to base.
Unlike commercial airlines, there was nobody that came onto the PA system and announced what was happening. So I just kind of focused on the children.
After struggling with his crippled jet, Trainer's efforts finally seem to pay off.
And now the airplane levels itself off, and we're saying, wow, thank goodness that we're finally making it out of this.
As quickly as it leveled off, the plane begins to climb again. The nose of the jet begins pulling up into the sky.
And so I relax the yoke, and what happens? Nothing. I'm still going straight up now.
Unless Trainer can gain some speed, his plane will soon stall and tumble from the sky.
And it got higher and higher, and pretty soon I'm going almost straight up.
In desperation, he dips one wing, forcing the nose down.
I'm now in a very, very steep dive, and there's nothing I can do, seemingly, to bring the nose up. And so, counterintuitive, I added power, and when I did that, the airplane pulled itself out of the dive, and I started to go back up again, but this time I stopped it at 10,000 feet and rolled out, and I realized that I had learned how to control the airplane.
Trainer can't control his plane's pitch as he usually does, by pushing and pulling on his control column. Instead, by gently increasing and decreasing power to his engines, he seems to be able to keep his plane level.
At that point, I realized that my only pitch control was the throttle.
The plane has descended to 10,000 feet. There's now enough oxygen to breathe.
100, it's safe to remove our mask. Gear down, before landing checklist.
I headed directly for Saigon and began a descent and began positioning myself for a final, much like you would in a glider.
Don't worry. They're taking care of it up in the cockpit. We're gonna be down soon.
I'm trying to provide comfort to these passengers. At the same time, I know we're in serious trouble because the airplane is still going down.
Captain Trainer has coaxed his injured jet down to just over 4,000 feet. 11 kilometers from the airport, he turns his jet to line up with the runway when his plane surprises him again.
In the final turn to the runway, when I banked the airplane, the nose dropped and I couldn't continue my turn. I had to level the wings so that I had enough lift that the nose didn't keep descending.
Captain Trainer had to stop turning before he could line up with the runway. He's now losing altitude fast, and his prospects are becoming increasingly grim.
While we were working in the cargo compartment, Loadmaster came to me and said, we need to get upstairs because we're going to crash land. When I get to the top of the ladder, I've changed my mind and think I need to be in the cargo compartment when this airplane does get on the runway so I can help evacuate down there. As I try to leave, the flight engineer grabs me by my left elbow, throws me into a seat, and about the time I hit the seat, I can hear the ground screaming. It's a loud scream. It's coming closer.
Prepare for an imminent crash landing.
Get down on the floor! Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
When we started to go down, my mother and I were focusing on what should we be doing to brace for impact.
We had a big open field in front of us. When I got within about 200 feet of the ground, I said, "We're going in."
The plane is hurtling towards the ground at almost 500 kilometers per hour.
I reach down, grab my seatbelt, and when the seatbelt snaps,
we touched the ground relatively easily, and we popped back in the air. The jump seat said to me, "Bud, we're gonna make it." But I could see looming ahead of me was this huge, huge river. So I added power.
My mom was on one side of the aisle, and I was on the other. And she says, "Come over here and sit with me."
And even with full power at that point, I was still continuing to sink.
my whole life went into slow motion. The airplane is coming apart where I'm sitting. All kinds of debris is flying through the air. And it went on and on and on. It seemed like forever.
When I was going upside down, I remember saying, goodbye to my wife a couple of times, because I was gone. And then it was quiet.
When the plane came to a stop, I looked for my mom. I didn't see her anywhere. At that point, it was all a little bit surreal that I didn't even really know what had just happened. All I knew was that we needed to get the babies out of there.
Trainer and the rest of the cockpit crew have survived.
When I stepped out of the window, what was clear after you looked around, the airplane broke up into its component parts. The tail dropped off, the flight deck broke away, the troop compartment and the wings, they separated from the cargo compartment. The cargo compartment itself disintegrated, essentially.
Behind the cockpit, the plane's wings, which hold the fuel tanks, are burning. The passenger section of the plane is largely intact and separated from the scorching heat of the burning wings. Lieutenant Wirtz and many others who had been in the passenger section survive.
Then we started bringing babies out. And I could hear some helicopters coming. At that point, I was not looking for my mother because I had been assured that she was okay. I was to go to the hospital and just wait for her there. And then that's when I took a couple of the babies and walked over and got on.
A day that began with the promise of hope has ended in disaster. Just minutes after the crash of the first baby lift mission, rescue workers are on the scene searching for survivors. Almost everyone in the cargo area was killed instantly when the plane slammed down the second time. The dead, the injured, and the survivors are taken to hospitals in Saigon and Thailand.
Since I was not injured, I just took a seat and was waiting for my mother while they brought in a lot of the babies. Then somebody came over to me and told me that my mother had died. I remember holding on for dear life, so she said, "Come over here and sit with me."
Barb Adams' last decision was to be near her daughter.
Just as I sat down on the floor, we must have hit. She flew forward somewhere. And that's the last time I saw my mother.
"175 people survived the crash of the Air Force jet. But more than 150 have been killed. More than half of them were children.
And it was really such a blow in what had already been a very tragic and sad story of the collapse of South Vietnam. And then who would have thought that in the middle of all that tragedy, that the American Air Force would crash a plane full of Vietnamese babies and small children.
The investigation begins immediately. The next day, along with the investigators, Captain Bud Traynor returns to the smoldering wreckage of his plane on a special mission of his own.
I had to leave a couple of crew members out at the aircraft. And so I went back the next morning.
The bodies of 2 dead crewmen are still pinned down by the wreckage.
So we took a lot of tie-down chains and put them together and did the old heave-ho with a whole lot of people to move the flap of wreckage that was pinning the 2 crew members. And we got them out of there. It's always important to finish the job, and we did. But then I had a very naive approach to what was going to happen next. I kind of envisioned the guys in the silver helmets and put out the white rope. This is going to be a secure site. And that was when I got the shock that, hey, there are no guards out here. There's a Vietnamese soldier going through my suitcase wearing my flight jacket. And he had an AR-15, and I didn't.
That's my jacket. I'm Bud Traynor.
And we established that my coat had the same name on it.
That's mine.
As my flight suit. And so the coat he was wearing was mine. So he begrudgingly gave me my coat and then proceeded to go through the rest of my suitcase.
It's not only Trainer's jacket. Looters are picking the plane clean. Dave Scheiding is a structural engineer with the Air Force.
When we got to the site, we had some concern to begin with because there was a tremendous amount of civilian people out there actually picking up parts, which, of course, that didn't help us much as far as the investigation goes.
He's part of a team that goes to Saigon to try to figure out why the plane crashed.
This investigation was very unique from a couple of standpoints. The first standpoint, of course, the people taking parts away from us, but second, the country was in extreme chaos. It was essentially falling.
Frank Huskin is also part of the investigative team.
The NVA and the VidCong are all around, and we were only out there during the daytime, but it was a very uncomfortable feeling. Very uncomfortable feeling.
One of the first things we wanted to rule out was sabotage and a bomb. So we brought in dogs from the Philippines, bomb-sniffing dogs.
Take him back there to the rear of the plane.
With North Vietnamese soldiers so close, a direct attack or sabotage are obvious theories.
Initially, they had all thought that it had been a bomb placed in the luggage compartment, or it had been a missile that shot the plane down.
During the rush to board the aircraft, personal luggage was loaded but not thoroughly checked. This added to the speculation that a bomb may have been smuggled on board. The dogs find no trace of a bomb, and investigators find no evidence of explosive residue on the plane. It clearly wasn't attacked. But something had caused the cargo door to fail.
We had to find the doors, if at all possible, to make sure that we didn't have a problem with other C-5s that would cause this type of crash.
Soon, the massive C-5As will be desperately needed to get America out of Vietnam. Finding out what happened to this one couldn't be more urgent.
It was beyond important. At the time, we had approximately 100 C-5 aircraft. We grounded the C-5s until such time that we could figure out, one, what the problem was, and two, what were we going to do to prevent it from happening again.
Hey, guys!
As they examine the wreckage, investigators also try to find out why the crew had such difficulty controlling the plane.
Look how this is sheared off.
The cables that Ray Snedeker saw leaking hydraulic fluid were the ones that controlled the plane's elevator. Since the elevator controls pitch, Captain Trainer had no way of guiding his plane up and down.
Cargo bay! Declare an emergency. Saigon. Emergency. Return to base.
When there's no control of the elevator, which allows for up and down pitch, an airplane will set up an oscillation up and down. His oscillation started as his nose was going down, and then it picked up speed, and then it started pitching up.
A falling plane's aerodynamic properties will force it to follow a predictable pattern. As lift increases, the nose naturally tilts upwards. Without the elevators to counteract the motion, it will continue until the plane moves so slowly that it stalls, falling back to the ground. It explains the strange motion of the giant C-5A. By adjusting the thrust to his engines, Trainer was able to keep the jet from rising and falling. Investigators believe the cables were sheared off when the cargo door exploded from the plane. But they still don't know why the door failed in the first place.
Then we made the determination we were going to have to try and find the doors.
But the doors are somewhere at the bottom of the South China Sea.
Our next problem was trying to figure out the ballistics of those doors. Nobody had ever even thought of figuring out ballistics of two doors flying through the air from 23,000 feet.
Relying on the airspeed and the altitude at the moment of decompression, investigators learned the plane was 46 kilometers from the coast of Vietnam.
When the doors went out, the airplane was moving across the water at about 600 feet per second. Therefore, we had to come down with a pretty good estimate for the Navy to even know where to look.
Ships from the U.S. 7th Fleet crisscrossed the South China Sea looking for the rear door. For the first several days, they can't find anything. The South China Sea has swallowed the evidence. At the crash site, investigators are becoming increasingly frustrated. A great deal of wreckage has been stolen by scavengers. An important clue could be among the pieces taken away. To retrieve these parts, the Air Force offers to buy them back.
The strategy was to provide leaflets throughout the city of Saigon and the surrounding area. We want every piece of material from the aircraft back, and we will also pay you if you will turn this in to us.
11 days after the crash, flyers are delivered to local officials and distributed throughout the city. Investigators do eventually recover the camera that was used by a film crew on board the plane. They hope it can show them exactly what happened. But the film inside the camera has already been removed. Another piece of the wreck turned in during the buyback program is just what they're looking for.
We were trying to get the black boxes back because that's the thing we really wanted.
All C-5As are fitted with a computer system that records vital information about the plane's operation. It records engine settings, airspeed, altitude, and hundreds of other parameters onto a magnetic tape. The system is called Mayday, Malfunction Detection Analysis and Recording System. It wasn't found at the crash site. The Mayday is eventually returned for a reward, but it proves to be a disappointment.
It didn't identify the reason for the doors and the ramps failing, but it did provide us a sequence of events in a lot of areas, including altitude, airspeed, the performance of the aircraft itself during that time frame.
As investigators continue to look for the cause of the crash, the situation in Vietnam gets worse. 2 days after they receive the Mayday, the South Vietnamese president resigns. On April the 23rd, 100,000 North Vietnamese troops approach Saigon. The noose around the city is tightening quickly.
While we were out in the rice paddy, you could see burning hamlets and villages, and in the distance they were on fire. You could hear the explosions and so forth of mortars.
While the situation in Vietnam continues to unravel, the US Navy finally has some success at sea. On April the 26th, they find the cargo ramp and part of the pressure door of Trainor's plane. If investigators don't find the answers here, they may not find them anywhere. They're running out of time, and they're running out of leads. When the ramp is examined, investigators make a disturbing discovery.
On that ramp, 2 of the stirrups were in great condition. They were perfect. They had not failed, so obviously it told us that at least 2 of the locks had just unlocked themselves.
The C-5A has 14 locks holding the rear cargo door shut, 7 on each side. The door recovered from the sea tells investigators that for some reason, 3 of the locks designed to hold it shut had either unlocked in flight or had never locked at all.
This flight was actually like a ticking bomb. When they closed the ramps, all those locks would look like they were in a locked position. When it took off, the fuse was lit. And as the aircraft climbed out, the fuse kept burning.
As the plane climbed away from Saigon, the pressure outside the jet dropped. The air inside pushed with increasing force against the cargo door. Then, as the plane passed through 23,000 feet, with 3 latches unlocked, the pressure on the door was too much.
With the 3 locks that failed all in a row, it was just too much load for the other 4 locks to actually pick up, and which resulted in the catastrophic failure of the ramp itself.
But investigators still don't know why the locks failed. Before they can find the answer, the situation in Vietnam deteriorates completely. Saigon is under siege. On April the 27th, the investigators take all of the evidence they can and leave. It's simply too dangerous to stay.
When we left Saigon, we were the last 2 C-141s to leave Tonson Air Base. They were essentially losing their country at that time, and after that it was only helicopters that got out.
Investigators hope they have all the clues they need to solve the mystery of the crash. They know they won't be coming back to Vietnam to look for any more. April the 30th, 1975. The war in Vietnam ends. From the rooftop of the American embassy, the last remaining Americans in Vietnam are flown to safety. Back in the United States, investigators continue their work. Since the C-5 is in service around the world, they need to know why 3 locks on the cargo door failed.
When we got back to Texas, it was to help us verify the failure sequence.
Investigators discover something potentially alarming about the cargo plane's rear door. Parts from the C-5A were actually removed from the plane, cannibalized to service another cargo plane. The locks on the rear door of the C-5A are connected to each other by a series of tie rods. The rods can be lengthened or shortened to ensure the locks are completely closed. It's these tie rods which were removed from the baby lift plane. At the time, the enormous cargo planes were in constant demand.
The Air Force was very short of parts, and so they came up with a standard practice for maintenance that they could cannibalize parts off of aircrafts that are not being flown. It's authorized, and it's a good operation if you respect it and treat it properly.
The tie rods were replaced before the baby lift plane left for Saigon, but for some reason they hadn't held. To try to figure out what happened, investigators rebuild one of the locks that was supposed to keep the rear door closed.
We essentially built a working model of that ramp, and we had to do that because we didn't get all the parts back because of the people picking them up, parts out in the ocean and everything that we never got back.
Investigators aren't convinced that the problem is in the basic design of the lock. They suspect that before the plane left California, the engineers who replaced the rods didn't follow the proper procedures.
When we're talking about the locks, the distances that we're talking about are very, very small. We could be talking about the 16th, 32nd of an inch difference between being locked and unlocked.
The re-rigging was done before the plane left the United States.
Show me how you re-rig it.
After the locks were re-rigged, they should have checked to make sure they were working. That wasn't done. Without the check, no one would have noticed that the re-rigging was done improperly.
I would say that this accident actually started back at Travis Air Force Base in California. When the 2 tie rods that had been cannibalized earlier were replaced, they were not installed properly.
Loadmaster, close cargo bay doors.
When the door was opened and shut in Saigon, there was a warning that not everything was perfect.
We had some difficulty getting it to lock, so we had to open and close it 3-4 times. But it seemed to be routine, and in the heat of the moment, we didn't think anything about it.
But 12 minutes after liftoff, as the plane continued to climb, The 3 improperly closed locks were forced open by the building air pressure. The remaining locks could not take the extra load. The cargo door burst open and was torn off the fuselage.
You just can't take shortcuts. And if it's pulled a couple of rods out, run out and put them back in, that's not going to hack it.
The investigators have found their answers, and in their final report make specific recommendations that will make the C-5A safer. As a result, the Air Force designs a pin that slips through each lock. If the door isn't properly shut, the pins can't slide into place.
We essentially Murphy-proofed it by putting steel pins in there so that when the lock is in the over-center position, if you can insert these safety pins, then you know that the system is properly rigged.
Ray Snedeker retired from the Air Force as a Chief Master Sergeant.
This mission was probably the most discouraging in some ways based on part of the outcome. But also, it was refreshing in the fact that we displayed such good airmanship, such courage, and we were able to save so many people.
After 28 years of service, Bud Traynor retired from the Air Force as a colonel.
I think everyone second guesses themselves to see if there was something else that they could do. I am very fortunate in that I never found something that I said, I sure wish I had done X. It just wasn't there.
That pilot did a super job. The fact that anybody survived this crash is just remarkable. The ones that were saved are very fortunate that that particular crew was in charge of that aircraft. Being a pilot myself and knowing they only had 1 aileron and 4 engines, by rights they all should have been dead.
Investigation Board does not normally recommend decorations. That's not part of their job. But in this case, we recommended to the Air Force that they be considered for a high decoration.
Surviving crew members, including Captain Bud Traynor and Sergeant Ray Snedeker, were awarded medals by the Air Force for heroism and extraordinary achievement. One of the orphans that survived was baby Ina.
Ina?
Today, she's known as Kelly Jackson Brownlee.
April 4th, 1975. It's definitely a pivotal point in my life where I left part of myself behind in Vietnam.
When Operation Baby Lift resumed, Kelly, along with hundreds of other orphans, were flown to the United States. She was eventually adopted by a family near Seattle, Washington.
There was a 25-year anniversary in April of 2000, and it brought together all of the adults that were adopted from Vietnam. And I ended up meeting someone who's very special and actually ended up marrying.
Chris Brownlee and his wife Kelly were both airlifted out of Vietnam on April the 5th, 1975, one day after the crash.